All right, looks like we finally got this thing working. So here are your notes. I sent you the notes a while ago. The screencast thing wasn't working, so here we go. We're going to talk about the emergence and spread of Islam, and we're going to skip through a lot of the stuff that we did in class, but it's important to understand the difference between expansion of Islam and spread of Islam. Okay, so expansion is the growth of the empire. Within that empire, people may or may not convert to Islam. If you think about it, Rome expanded their empire, but didn't force people to convert to their religion. So the Roman Empire expanded, but the Roman religion did not spread. And the expansion of Islam is going to be very quick. It's within 100 years, they're going to have an empire roughly the size of the Roman Empire before them. The people, however, are going to convert very slowly within that empire. So about 100 years later, the Islamic empire had expanded. See, even I got it wrong. Had expanded, but Islam spreads. The religion spreads, and it spreads very slowly. 500 years later, there were people within the Muslim empire who had not converted, because Islam is not going to force anybody to convert over to their religion. In the world today, the area that the Muslim empire expanded to, all of that area is still a majority Islam, except for Spain, who we'll talk about in a little bit. So eventually it did spread. As a matter of fact, the spread of the religion of Islam is still continuing. It's the fastest growing of the 5 major religions in the world. It's spreading into continents it's never been on or at before. But the expansion of the Muslim Empire has ended. What was the Muslim Empire became the Ottoman Empire, and it was taken out during World War I. So Islam is no longer expanding, but it is spreading. So it's going to take quite a long time for the spread of Islam to go throughout the empire. All right, so let's talk about the actual early conquests of the Islamic groups. And it starts with a guy named Abu Bakr, and this is him over here. Abu Bakr is the first of the caliphs. A caliph is a deputy or a successor to Muhammad. They all recognized that Muhammad was the prophet, and anybody who was going to come after him was not trying to be him. They all admit that they were trying to carry on his legacy and continue spreading Islam, but they were not Muhammad. Abu Bakr starts off at a huge disadvantage because not everybody in the Muslim world was on board with him being the leader. He was a religious leader, and he was one of Muhammad's closest allies religiously. He helped run the religion, but he was not a military leader. So those who have been loyal to Muhammad for military reasons or to be close to power did not necessarily follow Abu Bakr. But what he was able to do was all those who withdrew their loyalty to him and said, "We are not going to follow you," he was able to pull them back in with their belief in Islam, because he was a very talented religious leader. And this is kind of an overarching theme for the Muslim world, is oftentimes Muslim countries don't get along with each other. They have normal disputes between borders and other countries. But what does unite them is they're very devout Muslims. So there is relative peace between countries in that area of the world, only because of the devotion that they have towards Islam. If that were to ever break down, there's a lot of really old rivalries and nastiness that could take place. So after Abu Bakr takes over, they look around and they realize they are the only powerhouse in the area with like a powerful army. The Muslims, from the moment they were created, Islam had been attacked by all of its neighbors because they saw them as a threat. And all of those attacks met with failure. The Muslims, because of their devotion and their discipline, were able to defeat all of them. And Abu Bakr takes over a time when there were no real enemies nearby. So in order to protect their religion, realizing that everybody's going to keep attacking them, they go out and start attacking everyone else. And they end up taking over a really vast portion of what we now call the Middle East and Northern Africa, but would be better described as Southwest Asia and Northern Africa. They take over a lot of what was used to be called the Byzantine Empire. And if you remember, that's what's left of the Eastern Roman Empire after the Roman Empire split up. They're going to in that area, they're going to take out Syria and Palestine, 2 areas of the world that control a good portion of the Silk Roads. and have a lot of wealth. And they're going to take two of the most important cities in the world at the time, Damascus, which was one of the greatest cities in the world, and Jerusalem, which wasn't as good as Damascus, but was the center of both the Jewish and Christian faith. So it held a lot of importance for those religions. Then they turn and they conquer the massive Persian Empire, and they sweep in and they take over Egypt, which has a ton of food and was part of that Palestinian Empire. And they seem kind of unstoppable. And they're going to continue across all across northern Africa, and then they're going to get to a spot, and I'll show you right here. This is called Gibraltar, and they're going to march all the way across northern Africa, and then Gibraltar is only 8 miles where Africa separates Europe. So to cross from Africa to Europe only takes 8 miles here, and it's even got a little like space in between that makes it easy to land your troops. So they march right across, and they enter into Spain. And Spain is Christian territory. All of this area that they conquered before was not like the classic Roman Catholic Christian knights on horseback in armor kind of land. And we'll talk about how that made their conquering a little bit easier. But they cross into Spain in 711, only about 50 years after Muhammad dies. And they continue winning and winning until they hit a French army, well, a Frankish army, which are actually they're closer to Germans, but they controlled the part of the world that is now France. And they come up against Charles Martel. And Charles Martel is leading an army of united Christian knights from all over the area. And these Christian knights come out, and they actually beat the Muslims for the first time. And they do it mostly through advanced technology. They have plate armor. They have crossbows. They're able to charge into them with large cavalry that's faster and stronger than the camels that the Muslims are using. And they beat them in tours. But as we can see on the map, the Muslims don't leave Europe. They just fail to advance any farther. And what you see here is the height of the Muslim world, and it's pretty darn impressive. So they're going to stop advancing in Western Europe, but they're going to keep Spain for hundreds more years. And later on in like the 1500s or 1600s, we're going to finally see the Muslims kicked out of Spain. On the eastern side, they're going to get stopped at Constantinople, which is the capital of that Eastern Roman Empire, of that Byzantine Empire. And they're going to get retreat out of what we now call Turkey, but what's left of the Byzantine Empire. And they're going to continue eastward, and then they're going to later continue southward. And we're going to end up with a map that looks like this. Where are you? This right here. Okay? This green down here. It's a huge map, and they're going to control all of the Sahara Desert, all of the western half of the Silk Roads. And that's going to make them immensely wealthy. And there's a few reasons they were particularly successful. They did this in less than 50, 60 years. 622 is when Islam began, but the actual conquests were much shorter than that. And there's a couple reasons for that. First off, and most importantly, their neighbors were weak. The Byzantine Empire and the Persian empires were both failing from the inside. They were like that rotten Roman Empire. It looks impressive on paper, and it looks huge, but there's tons of corruption, and the people are starving to death, and the rich don't care, and they're fighting against each other because they shared a huge border over here. The Byzantines and the Persians didn't see anybody else to challenge them, so if they took the other one out, they'd dominate the world. So they spent all this time fighting each other with neither one really winning. And then along comes the Muslims and just wipes them both out. They had all kinds of internal pressures. They were going through civil wars, as I mentioned, starvation, corruption at the government level. And anybody who was not in the leadership position here was welcomed gladly south of there, which we now call Iraq, but at the time was called the Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent had been leeching all of the talented people who were sick of these guys. So they were just rotting from within. All their talent had been leaving, and their people were dying. In addition, the Muslim Empire was pretty smart about how they fought. They used the camel. And the big deal about the camel is they're a terrible mount. The horses are way better. But of course, the camel can run through the desert. And all of the major cities on the Silk Road, all of the capitals of these empires, where all the wealth and power was contained, had built up defenses, but they had left the side that faced the desert relatively undefended because nobody can attack from the desert. I mean, they're not vulnerable. So if I've got $1 million to spend and I can only build a half a wall, I'm going to build a heck of a wall that faces the ocean, and I'm going to ignore the side that faces the desert. And then comes these Arab tribes, these Muslim groups mounted on camels, and they sweep in from the deserts, and they're able to take some of these cities relatively easily. They were also efficient, which means they were very careful not to lose soldiers. They didn't fight battles that they knew they couldn't win. They kept their army intact. And the last thing that made them so powerful was that they were unified by Islam. These were all very devout Muslims, and they believed that if you fought in defense of your religion, then you would go to their version of heaven, which is paradise. So that made them incredibly inspired and tough fighters. The concept that dying in battle would automatically give you a seat in the afterlife is not new, but it's the only of the 5 major religions that believes it. So when they took an area, the Muslims were actually fairly nice to the people under their rule. And this helps them conquer more because they don't have to worry about rebellion. As a matter of fact, the areas that the Muslims conquer are going to be pretty peaceful quite a long time. So a lot of different people are going to be joined together, and that's going to encourage even more sharing of information and more trade. They did allow anybody to practice any religion they want. You just had to pay a special tax. And the justification for taxing non-Muslims is Muslims already paid a type of taxes. It's one of their 5 pillars, the almsgiving or the charity. They were required to take care of the poor and the needy. Well, non-Muslims weren't required to do that, but there were lots of poor and needy in the empire. So the non-Muslims kind of were forced to pay this tax to help take care of the empire. And it was not a particularly large tax, but if you paid that tax, not only could you practice whatever your faith you wanted, but you were a loyal citizen, and they even put you in important government positions. They, of course, were not priests because they weren't Muslims, but they could be doctors, they could be translators, they could run areas, they could be governors. They were not generals in the military. That was a little too important of a position to have somebody who didn't believe in Allah. But they were incredibly nice compared to other areas when it comes to letting people live their own life. In time, as a result, a lot of those people end up converting to Islam because it's not only convenient, but Islam is an incredibly, at the time, peaceful, progressive religion. The people were very successful and patient. And it seemed like a religion that, unlike Christianity, which at the time was going through its issues, kind of had their poop in a group, you know? The height of the Muslim Empire is the Umayyad Dynasty. And this is the land that they controlled. And they're going to establish a dynasty at the end of the conquering period in 750 CE. They're going to bring lots of learning and architecture. They're going to make a ton of money off of the Silk Roads. They're going to establish their capital in Damascus. Damascus and Peking in China, which is now Beijing, and I can't think of the other one, are the 3 biggest and most important cities at the time. So Damascus is huge. One of the issues they're going to have is they were desert fighters. These were people that were used to sacrifice and living a very tough life. And now all of a sudden they're going to be transplanted in these very decadent cities. And it's a very different lifestyle, and they knew they weren't going to be able to force the people in those cities into sacrificing and living a very Spartan, tough lifestyle. So they let the people of the area rule themselves for the most part. So Persians got to run Persia. Christians got to run Spain. Greeks got to run other parts because the Romans had used the Greeks and had put them in positions of power. So they weren't prideful. They didn't say, like, we're here to run the place and you better listen to us. They understood that if they want an empire and they want to run an empire, people are going to have to be happy. Unfortunately, the downfall of the Umayyad Dynasty is an important lesson to learn, is they got wealthy and they got soft. They lost track of what made them powerful, which was the discipline and the devotion and the hard work. And they got wealthy and they started living in castles and hoarding gold and making new rules that only benefit them and hurt the poor and the weak. And remember, the whole point of one of the 5 pillars is to take care of the weak, and they stopped doing that. So one of the results is they start seeing problems because a lot of the Muslims that are citizens inside their empire they just want to go back to the old days where things were normal. Like we didn't have incredibly poor people, incredibly rich people. Everybody